And I got up at like 2 p.m, got off the sofa one day, and I just thought, yeah, I cannot achieve what I want to achieve in life if I'm getting out of bed at 2 p.m. And something just snapped, and I just accepted I had a problem at that point, and called a 12-step group, called AA, called Alcoholics Anonymous the next day. And that was it. I haven't drunk since. I haven't had a drop since. But the other realization was over time that they characterize it as a disease. And I was talking to other people who really rejected that idea, and they were like, yeah, you're stuck in a cycle. They're going to have you thinking you're a victim of this disease. And it's not. You can get to the bottom of this. You don't have to become reliant on 12-step groups for the rest of your life. We can heal our pain. We can work towards curing ourselves of compulsions, addictions, neuroses in general, by going back and reliving past experience. This form of therapy isn't particularly popular for a reason, and it's because it's hard going, and that's why I call it extreme therapy. Right? It's tough. The therapist allows you to express all that you couldn't say, feel, think in that moment, and that releases something, and often that you'll get to some tears. Ultimately you'll get to some grief, and that is what Janov talks about, and that's grieving the unmet need. So there will have been a need you had in that moment that was unmet, and when you ultimately experience that lack of having had that need met, you get to the grief and you get to the tears and you cry, and that's a little bit of your pain reservoir drained forever, and that's why it's curative. It's like you have this pool of pain. So Arthur Janov's wife used to talk about it as emptying a bathtub with a teaspoon, and it's like once you've taken that bit of pain out, it's gone forever. I was also reading a book by Arthur Janov called The Biology of Love, and in it he describes in depth how the birth experience impacts our lives, and actually the birth experience has a much bigger impact than anything else, certainly if we've had a traumatic birth. And I knew that I had a really traumatic birth. I knew I'd nearly died in birth. I knew that there was some stuff with my childhood, but it was paled in comparison to the birth experience that I'd had. I had forceps delivery. I suffered something called fetal bradycardia, which is a drop in the heart rate, and there are records of that. So I definitely had a traumatic birth. I definitely nearly died, and now have no doubt that I had a traumatic birth, and I have no doubt that it impacted me to an enormous extent in terms of my personality, expression of my sexuality, just almost every aspect of who I am. And notice that when I used to go to the gym to work out, I'd sometimes get this kind of gagging reflex thing happening, which I wasn't clear about, and this sort of spluttering. And so I decided I'd just go with it, right? I'd just go with whatever this thing was that was happening. Left my dumbbells, went upstairs to an empty Pilates studio, and took them out and allowed myself just to go on the floor and let it all come. And then all this gurgling and burbling and dribbling and coughing and choking, just there on the floor in the Pilates studio and it all coming up. And at some level, I was also conscious of it and thinking, I'm not acting this. This isn't auto-suggestion. Something real is happening here. My temperature's gone up. I'm sweating. I cannot be putting this on. And the Pilates teacher came in and abruptly ended my self-regression session. So I had 4.5-hour sessions, like on the mat, screaming and gurgling and dribbling and all the rest of it. You have such deep insights when you start doing this work that it's like, at a cellular level that what you're doing is beneficial. And you have these moments where you're like, that's why I've been doing that my whole life. That's why I'm so compulsive around those type of people. That's why I did this. That's why I can't do that. It just becomes so abundantly clear what has been driving or what it became so abundantly clear to me what had been driving my dysfunctional behaviors, and seeing the drop off in the dysfunction week on week, month on month, it became self-evident that this was working. Birth matters. That's the number one takeaway there. So for those of us who had a difficult birth, then what I've learned is that there's been nothing more valuable than in my life than to go back and process that. You carry your past with you in every moment, and to the extent that you've got pain in you is the extent to which you cannot live the fullest, richest life in this moment. And that's the place to go if you want to live a fuller, richer life. For those of you who have had significant adverse experiences in birth or early childhood, then don't get overwhelmed by that. There's a way that you can work at that slowly over time that gradually improves your life.
Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of the Truth, Health, Freedom podcast. My guest today is Richard Atherton. He's a course mate on the London Real Broadcast Yourself Academy, and he's the founder of the Being Human podcast. Richard has asked to come on the show today to tell his own story. It's a story I would never have expected to look at him. He seems like a really nice bloke, but to look at him, there's nothing out of the ordinary. But what Richard's story shows is something that I've learned in life, which is that everyone has a story that we know nothing about. Everyone is fighting a battle that we know nothing about. And Richard has decided to tell his story to the world in the hope that it might help others who are experiencing similar issues. So here's my interview with Richard Atherton. Hello and welcome to the Truth, Health, Freedom podcast. My guest today is coach, writer, speaker, and now fellow podcaster, Richard Atherton. He is the creator of a brand new podcast called Being Human. So, Richard, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, I've just been out in the garden trimming back some errant shrubs.
Good
yes,
for you.
really good.
Getting in touch with the earth. Now, Being Human, your new podcast, what's it all about? Why did you decide to start a podcast? What do you hope that you're going to gain from it? And what do you hope your audience can gain from it?
Yeah, why did I start the podcast? Because I wanted to broaden the conversation that we're having in businesses primarily. So this is a business, it's a podcast aimed at people working in, organizations. And the mission is to bring a deeper conversation to the management and leadership discourse. So my aim with the podcast is to interview guests who are prepared to go deeper in a conversation about how to be an effective human at work and in life. So that means interviewing therapists, that means interviewing leadership coaches, that means interviewing people who've got a view on the effectiveness of organizations and are prepared to touch into deeper human questions.
Fantastic. And are you enjoying it so far?
I'm loving it. Yeah. In fact, yesterday I got my first bit of feedback from the episode on clean language with Judy Reese, who is a coach and takes a special questioning technique called clean language to work with people. It's an offshoot of NLP. And this guy emailed me and said, I watched the episode, loved it, I'm going to start trying it. And I was just blown away. I was so touched that somebody had found it, watched it, taken something from it, and we're going to do something different in their lives. So already, just with that one piece of feedback, it's got me buzzing and feeling like I've done the right thing by starting it.
Brilliant, because that's why we do it, so we can touch someone's lives.
Exactly.
Well, touch as many as we can, hopefully. And if you just touch one, that makes it all worthwhile. If you change one life, it makes it all worthwhile. Now, I read that obviously you're a coach, writer, speaker, now podcaster. You've also had some very interesting careers as well. You've had a few lives in this life. You've been a stand-up comedian, you've run cabaret nights, and you've been a talent agent. So how did you stumble into that?
Well, that's okay. So I was working at what was then Arthur Andersen, a big four accounting firm for people who know about accounting firms. So a very big accountancy firm, which then became Deloitte, another big accountancy firm. And feeling like it was doing really well in the career and enjoying it, but feeling like I couldn't express all the facets of myself that I wanted to express I was not an accountant, actually, I was a management consultant. And did some self-development work. And as a result of one of these self-development courses, I ran a barn dance, a charity barn dance in the middle of London, in West London, in an old music hall. Had a huge amount of fun running that event, made a massive amount of money for the NSPCC. I thought, oh, well, this is fun. And I've got to express a lot more of myself through this than I have through my consulting at the time. So I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start running events and had this image in my mind of a scene in Scarface where De Niro and Pfeiffer, their characters at least, are in this sumptuous jazz cafe in this rich velvet banquette, sort of talking over a cocktail with this jazz singer on the stage. And I just thought, wow, there's nothing like that in London. There's nothing that decadent, that glamorous that I would want to, that I know of, that I could go to. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to create that scene. I'm going to create that event. And started putting on cabaret events with burlesque singers and poets and stand-up comedians and performance artists, singers, whoever I thought was talented, whoever I thought would make an impact, who had something different to say. And yeah, it was a great success. Yeah, I mean, it took a while to get it profitable on the business side, but yeah, in terms of audience, we built an audience pretty quickly and took on Café de Paris in the centre of town, and then moved to a famous venue, the Grill Room, which is part of Café Royal, on Regent Street, and built it up and had a huge amount of fun doing that. I was compere, and we built the business around it. And then people would come to us and say, "Hey, can you give us a version of that for our company event, or can we hire that act that was on your show?" And so a talent agency emerged out of running that show, really. So sort of found myself within 6 months of leaving consulting, running this cabaret event and being a talent agent.
And you still do that?
No.
Just a fun episode from your past.
Exactly, yeah. We had a good run, and actually I decided, I was really jealous of the stand-up comics. I was thinking, oh man, I want to be one of the acts, not the guy introducing the act. So decided that would be my path instead. So dived into that, actually switched courses and started doing stand-up instead.
That's brave. So podcasting must be nothing for you.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I still get a bit nervous, but no, you're right. Nothing quite like walking out on stage coming to mind a Saturday night in Carlisle. Yeah, I had some moments where I felt pretty nervous doing stand-up. Yeah.
Any bad experiences?
Oh, tons. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I've been booed off stage at least twice in my memory. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Bad nights are bad doing stand-up. Yeah, the good nights are awesome. I mean, like nothing I've ever experienced, but the bad nights are, horrific.
Brave man. Well, you've got my respect, and I can guarantee you I'm not going to boo you off this interview. So I'll reassure you from the off. Now, the reason we've set up this interview is actually for a slightly more serious subject, although I could see it being a rich source for comedy as well, which is that you told me that you wanted to talk about your journey to recovery from addiction through what you described as extreme therapy. So I'd like to take you back to the beginnings of this. What was the addiction, or what were the addictions? And what were the early signs? What was it that made you or those close to you think that you might have a problem?
Right. Okay. So multiple addictions. The main addiction, or certainly the one that I first really became aware of and allowed myself to admit to, was alcohol. And yeah, when did I first become aware of it? I mean, I think I first became aware of it in university when I read an article. So I studied electronic engineering at Southampton University, and I read a magazine article about alcoholism, and there was this phrase in this article. I can't remember anything else about the article other than the phrase, which was binge alcoholic. And at the time, that really resonated. I thought, yeah, maybe I'm a binge alcoholic, but didn't really think anything of it. I was doing well in my degree. I was looking forward to going and getting a corporate job after university. So it wasn't like at the time I felt like I needed to do anything about it. I was 21, I was 22, and I felt like I had it all mastered, and this wasn't something I needed to worry about. Yeah, so what if I'm a binge alcoholic? So what if I drink heavily? I get up in the morning, I'm succeeding academically, I'm sure I'll succeed professionally. I had no sense that this was a problem in my life, even though I accepted that I was a binge alcoholic. So that was the very first inkling or acceptance of that label. And it was another 10 years until I decided that it was a problem. Yeah.
Okay. So what made you decide it was a problem? I can imagine it being at university, you're surrounded by people who are binge drinking regularly. So it might not stand out, but if this goes on for 10 years, there must have been some point, or was it a gradual realization? And was it you that realized, or was it someone else? How did this come to your attention?
Right. So, yeah. So I suppose a couple of things. One is that as I went through my 20s, I was experiencing a lot of my friends getting married, some of them having kids, and having conversations which went along the lines of, I can't drink like I used to. I have to get up. I can't deal with my kids on a hangover. And hearing those stories and thinking, actually, I drink as much as I did when I was a student, if not more on occasions. My drinking hasn't slowed down at all. And really, so that was, I suppose, the inkling of there was something different in my experience of drinking. This wasn't something I grew out of. This wasn't something where I got to my mid-20s and started to slow down, and maybe it went from a few big nights a week in the case of some of my friends to maybe one big night a week and then one big night a month, and there was a tapering perhaps of their drinking, whereas for me it was I was still getting very drunk 3 or 4 nights a week all the way through my 20s. So I was high functioning, so it was, but I still held down my jobs. I didn't it wasn't affecting my life, certainly professionally. But I did get to the end of my 20s early and start to look around and think, well, I don't have a serious relationship. My career's going okay, but I still basically live like a student. I'm in a shared flat, actually living with people in their early 20s often, and starting to assess my life and think, there's some development I haven't gone through here. My other friends have got in a very different place over this period. And so I was kind of in that space, but still not really accepting that I had a problem. And then right at the start of this conversation, we talked about the self-development course that I did. And two things came out of that. One was this charity barn dance. But the second was a real realization that I was an acceptance that I was an alcoholic. So I'll never forget the conversation I had with a doctor who was on this course, and he actually ran an alcohol program in his hospital. He's a pretty prominent heart surgeon, and he took, and I think that mattered actually, because I saw him at some level as being a sort of an authoritative figure. So what he said definitely had an impact. And two things happened actually in succession. So I'll come back to him. So the first thing that happened was, as part of this program, we had to show up and do call people, like sales calls basically, to see if other people wanted to come and do the course. And which is one of the reasons it sometimes gets accused of being a cult, because it is kind of aggressive on the sales front. So you do sort of end up losing a few friends doing it, but nonetheless, actually it was very positive for me, because I'd show up and do these, you have to go and volunteer for 2 or 3 hours or whatever, getting on the phone and making these calls. And I showed up after work, I'm still working my corporate job. I showed up after work, and the guy who was like the team leader for the evening, I said, Richard, I'm going to have to send you home. I'm like, you what? You have to send Richard Atherton, the great management consultant, you're sending me home from this shitty self-development volunteering session? What do you mean? And he's like, no, you're not present on the calls to people. You're not present. And he stood his ground. He said, no, Richard, I want you to leave. I want you to go home. And I was mortified. I was absolutely mortified that how dare he tell me that, that I can't make some cold calls. But it really hit me, because it was the first time in my life someone had said, basically, your drinking's affecting you, Richard. Because I was horrifically hungover. I'd probably had 3 hours sleep and done an entire day in the office. So, I was exhausted and I was hungover and running on adrenaline. And yeah, I can absolutely imagine that I wasn't particularly present on the phones to people. And so that started to hit me. That was like the first slap in the face to say, you haven't got this as handled as you might like to think you have, Richard. And then as part of the same course, I was having these conversations with this doctor, and he brought back this binge alcoholic concept. And he said, Richard, not everybody's putting gin on their cornflakes for breakfast, right? That there are different types of alcoholic. And he told me the story of a guy who he knew who lived on a houseboat and drank heavily every weekend, but didn't drink during the day. He was not a day drinker. He only drank in the evenings, and he didn't drink every night of the week. And he said that this guy drank in that pattern and saw his life get smaller and smaller over time. And that really struck a chord. And I thought, well, maybe I'm that guy, right? I don't drink during the day. My life kind of functions, but maybe my life is getting smaller. And so I started to do these pacts with this guy, and he'd say like, okay, and I'd say him, okay, look, I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to get drunk. My thing was, I've got it handled. I've only got a problem if I get drunk, and I'd say to him, right, I'm going to go for this whole month and I won't get drunk. I'm only gonna have like 1 or 2 drinks. If I go out, I'm only gonna have 1 or 2 drinks. And every time I'd have this pact with him, and then he'd ask me, so how did you get on? I'd be like, oh, well, yeah, no, I did get drunk that one time. And I kept trying and I kept falling. And actually the tipping point was, I was still running my cabaret show at the time. And I got up at like 2 p.m, got off the sofa one day. And I just thought, yeah, I cannot achieve what I want to achieve in life if I'm getting out of bed at 2 p.m. And something just snapped, and I just accepted I had a problem at that point, and called a 12-step group, called AA, called Alcoholics Anonymous the next day. And that was it. I haven't drunk since. I haven't had a drop since.
And how many years ago was that?
Well, over 10 years ago now. So yeah, 10 and a half years ago.
So that very day you stopped dead, and stopped dead to begin your life, pretty much. A new life.
Not quite, actually, because I called them that day, and then I went out that night and I agreed to go to and worked out which meeting I was going to go to, like the first meeting, which was on the Sunday. And that night was my kind of last night before I was going to do this meeting. And I said to my friend who I met in a pub, I was like, right, that's it. I've stopped drinking. I'm going to AA tomorrow. And he's like, brilliant. That's brilliant. My nickname is Af, from Atherton, Af. And he's like, that's great, Af. It's brilliant. I'm with you. What do you want to drink? And I was like, I'll just have a blackcurrant. And so it brings back this, red drink, and I drink the blackcurrant. He's like, I slipped to the vodka in that, mate. I hope you don't mind.
It's lovely when your mates care.
So that was actually my last drink.
Yeah. So just the one. So you didn't have any more after that. You didn't think, oh well, I've had one. I might as well go the whole way now.
No, thankfully, someone was looking down at me. Whatever. I didn't know that really was it then.
And how many years ago was that?
Yeah. So 10 and a half years ago.
10 and a half. So that's quite an achievement. Well done. That's brilliant. Now, you say you went to 12-step. How did you find that process? Was it something that resonated with you? Was it something that helped you? What did you gain from that?
Yeah, so it really helped to begin with because it stabilized my life, right? And it gave me a bunch of mates who didn't drink, and a lot of my best friends at the time were big drinkers. So that was like one plus. I had a social network I could tap into who were sober, which really helped. And they gave me support and tips. I can remember ringing. We have this idea of a sponsor in AA, where like a kind of senior buddy or somebody you buddy up with, and I'd call them like just before I was going to a pub, say, where I knew a bunch of my old friends would be drinking, and just kind of check in, and they'd be like, have you had some sweets? Because that was one of the ideas, was that you should keep your blood sugar high if you're going to be in a situation where you're exposed to drink. So little tips and moral support in those early days really helped. And then after about 3 months, any craving for alcohol left me. So I was really fortunate, because I know that there are some people who, that craving never leaves them, right? They're kind of fighting the craving their whole lives. But I didn't have that, which was just really lucky. And so after 3 months, it became more of just a way to manage my life, help me feel more connected to people around me, and as I say, stabilize. So that was the big help from it. But the other realization was over time that they characterize it as a disease. And I was talking to other people who really rejected that idea, and they were like, yeah, you're stuck in a cycle. They're going to have you thinking you're a victim of this disease. And it's not. You can get to the bottom of this. You don't have to become reliant on 12-step groups for the rest of your life.
So meaning it's a disease with no cure.
Exactly.
And you believed that there was a cure, that there was a way that you could be free of this altogether.
Well, I didn't believe it at the time, but I thought that's a much more interesting idea to pursue. And I'd definitely like to just find out if that is true. So that was what motivated me to start looking outside of 12-step, or what you might call palliative methods that are dealing with the symptoms. Yeah.
And this friend clearly did believe it's true. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said what he said. So what did you do? What was your next step? And what did you find on this search?
So the next step, he recommended me a book called Homecoming by a guy called John Bradshaw. And he first introduced me to this idea of going back. Going back in therapeutic terms. And he has this concept of an inner child, that we hold this inner child who holds all of our experiences, which is actually an idea I now reject, but at the time it was useful, because it started me, and certainly the exercises in his book, that they encourage you to write down parts of your past, but not just write them down as a means to get some insight into why you are who you are. And that was something I was experienced with a different therapist. It was more like to go back and relive, to try and re-experience those moments. And I started to do that with his work, just from the book. And then I connected with another guy in a different 12-step group, and he pointed me in the direction of a therapist. Her name is Andina Sears, and she took his work, but she was also influenced by other writers and thinkers, but still committed to this same idea that we can heal our pain, and we can work towards curing ourselves of compulsions, addictions, neuroses in general, by going back and reliving past experiences. So it was that book, Homecoming by John Bradshaw, and then my first interactions with Andina Sears, who's a therapist in London.
Okay, so you were seeing Andina Sears, and what did this therapy actually involve? What did you experience? What does it look like? And how did it make you feel? Could you feel it?
Yeah, so with Andina, what does it feel like? So it feels rough a lot of the time, because you're going back and feeling old, painful experiences. So you're reliving experiences from certainly with her, it was childhood a lot. And often it's about saying the thing you didn't say then. So you go back and say the thing you wanted to say to your father in that moment, or your mother in that moment, and say it, and allow all the feeling that's associated with that come up as you re-experience and as you re-articulate what it is you could have said had you been able to. And of course, when we're small children, we have to defend ourselves, to use the jargon, but we have to repress and suppress our feelings in order to survive and manage our interactions with our parents, because we have evolutionary mechanisms which have us negotiate our family system to survive in the best way we can. So of course we modify our behavior, and we modify our expression to survive, and as a result we traumatize ourselves at some level. And so that was, and what she had me do was go back and open up and relive and express, as I say, what we would have said, would have done.
So you described the sessions as rough. How about when you went home after the session, throughout the week after it? How did you feel then?
Pretty exhausted a lot of the time. I mean, it's not, this form of therapy isn't particularly popular for a reason. And it's because it's hard going. And that's why I call it extreme therapy, right? It's tough. It's not like you sit down on a couch and you talk about your childhood and you have some intellectual conversations to try and understand why it is you do what you do, and why it is you are who you are. This is getting back in the trenches and reliving and feeling old pain, to use the jargon. So it's not pleasant. It's just not pleasant, but it's ultimately relieving, and it's ultimately curative. No pain, no gain.
So you did feel it was worth it. Even at the very beginning, you thought this is worth carrying on with.
Yeah, there was a little bit of faith and a little bit of intuition. I think there was a little bit of faith which just said, let's just go for it. I'd read a lot around it, so I was already intellectually fairly convinced that this was valid, but ultimately needed a little bit of faith and just some inner voice in me suggesting, yeah, come on, keep going with this, and just prepared to give it a try, because I definitely didn't want to be, as Dina described it, maintaining a social addiction to 12-step meetings. And I know that people in 12-step would reject that and say, oh no, these are incredibly beneficial meetings and the community for their lives, and I don't doubt that, and of course that's absolutely true. But for me, at least, I didn't want to be reliant on these groups to stay stable.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't want to be reliant on something for the rest of your life. So how much of this therapy did you anticipate that you might need, and how much did you actually need?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't really think it through. I didn't know how long it would take. I mean, I did hang on to something that somebody told me in a 12-step group, which was it takes 10 years to get your marbles back, and another 10 years to learn how to play with them. So I thought, so if that's a reasonable, even on the 12-step path, if that's a reasonable time frame, like decades, to get to a place where you're feeling better, and maybe that does work. Maybe through some other process, if you hang around and do the work in 12-step groups long enough, you may get to a similar place. I mean, I can't see how that would be true, but nonetheless, I suppose that had me frame this project in the right time frame, absolutely, and that was think in terms of years and decades, not months. Which is why I look at like the CBT stuff on the for the UK listeners, the NHS, the National Health Service here, and it's 6 free sessions, and I look at that and think,
what can possibly be achieved in 6
exactly.
sessions? Yeah. So you say you were reliving the experiences. How does a therapist get you to relive the experience? Are they using some kind of hypnosis or regression technique?
Yeah, so it is a regression technique. So So all of these styles of therapy I put under the banner of regression therapy, to be and somewhat distinguished from past life regression, which I've got no experience of, but certainly what I'm talking about here has nothing to do with past lives. But it's really simple. Here's the way it goes. So you go into a session and you say, the shopkeeper looked at me funny and I got irritated, right? You take some moment from your day and
So your present day.
My present day. And Arthur Janov, who's now dead, but wrote Primal Scream, and he's probably the sort of godfather of the regression therapists, if you like. But he describes that as first line. So that's a first line consciousness or a first line experience, but a present moment experience. And so let's say I look at the shopkeeper, the shopkeeper looks at me in a funny way, I get irritated. So I dwell on that feeling. And then so that's the first question the therapist asks, describe a moment in your day where you felt some emotion. And then they'll say, okay, so is that familiar? And I'll be like, oh yeah. You don't get there immediately. This takes time. But once you build some facility with these techniques, you'll be like, yeah, actually, yeah, that is familiar. And yeah, that was exactly how my dad used to look at me, right? So then the therapist will be like, oh, well, tell me more about that experience. What was it like, that experience with your father, right? And you say, oh, well, I used to feel really anxious. And then the therapist will tell me more about that anxiousness. Where in your body do you feel that? And really help you embody and ground yourself in that former moment, that past moment, and really, really dwell in it, right? And that's called second line. That's when the therapist takes you into the second line, or the childhood experiences. And then the therapist might ask, well, what would you have said to your father in that moment had you felt free to? Well, I would have said, fuck you, or I would have said, or I would have hit him, or I would have stamped on his foot, and then the therapists were like, well, we'll do that, right? We'll do what you would have done. And the therapist allows you to express all that you couldn't say, feel, think in that moment. And that releases something. And often that you'll get to some tears. Ultimately you'll get to some grief. And that is what Janov talks about. And that's grieving the unmet need. So there will have been a need you had in that moment that was unmet. And when you ultimately experience that lack of having had that need met, you get to the grief and you get to the tears and you cry, and that's a little bit of your pain reservoir drained forever. And that's why it's curative. It's like you have this pool of pain, and so Arthur Janov's wife used to talk about it as emptying a bathtub with a teaspoon. And it's like, once you've taken that bit of pain out, it's gone forever.
And then it takes a lot of teaspoon ladling to empty the bath. Yeah, it sounds like two things are going on there. It sounds like obviously you're getting in touch with the pain. Was that pain repressed at the time? Is the theory that you couldn't feel it at the time? Is
that couldn't feel it at the time.
And then clearly you couldn't express that pain either. So one, you can't feel it, and two, you can't express it. So it sounds like you're going back to feel it. Only by feeling it can you heal it, but then feeling it's not quite enough. You've actually got to express it, hence the stamping and the hitting. And so what do you do?
Yeah.
You hit your therapist instead, or
you just keep punching your therapist until you get it out of your system. You punch whatever, you punch the wall, or you punch a pillow, and it's not always that. I mean, so often the first step is get to the anger, and then you'll get to the sadness beneath the anger. Sometimes there's it's not always the case that you got to get to the anger first. It may be, maybe the other feelings are on the way ultimately to the grief. But often it's to express it and get it out, you need to start with the anger.
Okay, so you're going to these sessions, and how is this affecting your life on the outside? When you go to work, your home life, your relationships? What's going on there?
Great question. And it's highly disruptive is the straight answer. So I took this a step further. So Andina's based in London, in East London. I don't know if she still practices, actually. I'm not sure she does, but I discovered through my work with her that actually, I'll tell a quick story and then to give it some context. But so I was working with her and we were doing a lot around childhood, but I was also reading a book by Janov called The Biology of Love. And in it, he describes in depth how the birth experience impacts our lives. And actually the birth experience has a much bigger impact than anything else, certainly if we've had a traumatic birth. So I was reading this and I was aware of it. And I was also doing this work with Andina where I was getting some access into some old feelings and so on. And noticed that when I used to go to the gym to work out, I'd sometimes get this kind of gagging reflex thing happening, which I wasn't clear about, and this sort of spluttering. And so I decided I'd just go with it, right? I'd just go with whatever this thing was that was happening. Left my dumbbells, went upstairs to an empty Pilates studio and took a mat and allowed myself just to go on the floor and let it all come. And then all this gurgling and burbling and dribbling and coughing and choking, just there on the floor in the Pilates studio and it all coming up. And at some level, I was also conscious of it and thinking, I'm not acting this. This isn't auto-suggestion. Something real is happening here. My temperature's gone up. I'm sweating. I cannot be putting this on. And the Pilates teacher came in and abruptly ended my self-regression session. So I apologize for dribbling on her mat and pulled myself together. But that was the moment where I was like, okay, right, there's something going on with my birth. And then signed up for what was a 20-day like intensive experience at the Primal Center in Venice in California. And went and did that trip. So in answer to your question, how disruptive was it? Yeah, pretty disruptive because that was 3 weeks out. And then I kept coming back. So basically then I was in a pattern of I'd go to California. I did that. And then I was in like immediately, okay, this is where I really need to be because they take me to my birth. And I knew that I had a really traumatic birth. I knew I'd nearly died in birth. I knew that there was some stuff with my childhood, but it was paled in comparison to the birth experience that I'd had. And so then I was like, sure, okay, this is it. I've got to go to the birth. I've got to keep doing the primal stuff. And then was in a pattern of saving up some money in London, getting on a plane, going to LA, staying in LA for 3 months, doing therapy every day, going back to London, get some more money. So I was in a pattern like that for like 3 or 4 years of just doing as much therapy as I could. And then even when I was back in London, I was doing therapy on Skype, which in itself is pretty disruptive because it just wipes you out for the whole evening. And usually, in the morning, you're bawling your eyes out and trying to get yourself together to go to work. So it's a huge, or at least for me, that's my experience of it. It's highly disruptive, but I just knew I was emptying this pain tank, and I knew I was going to get better. So I kept going.
So it sounds almost more disruptive than the binge drinking itself.
Yeah.
But you must have had a faith, and like you say, an intuition was the word you used, that this is working on some deep level. You must have known you are getting to the root and this is working and it is going to benefit your life because you use the word extreme therapy. These are extreme measures that you're taking to go off for 3 months and do that. That's, for a professional man, that's very unusual. So do you know where that belief came from?
Well, I suppose it just all seemed to make sense. I'd had these weird tics since I was a kid with the birth stuff. And I think the thing is, you have such deep insights when you start doing this work that you it's like at a cellular level that what you're doing is beneficial, and you have these moments where you're like, that's why I've been doing that my whole life. That's why I'm so compulsive around those type of people. That's why I did this. That's why I can't do that. It just becomes so abundantly clear what has been driving, or what it became so abundantly clear to me what had been driving my dysfunctional behaviors, and seeing the drop off in the dysfunction week on week, month on month, it became self-evident that this was working.
So it's not just a recognition of that's where the problem came from. It's actually the solution, and you can feel and see in your everyday life that you are behaving better, you're feeling better, you're functioning better, and so you carry on. Wow,
Yeah.
that's incredible.
And I'd get I'd get unsolicited feedback. I mean, I remember this female friend of mine saying to me, and she'd known me for years, and this was about 5 years into the therapy, and she maybe hadn't seen me for a few years, and she's like, "What's happened? You're normal." And then another, it tended to be female friends actually, who seemed to pick up on it more than male friends, and another one saying, yeah, you're so much more mature. And then another male friend, actually, he said, my nickname had been all through university, been Tricky, you know, Tricky Dicky, Tricky. And he's like, you're not tricky anymore. You're not tricky. You're just not tricky. So like the nicknames didn't fit anymore. So yeah, I was getting all this feedback that I was changing.
That's amazing. And how long did this carry on for? Did you actually, has this come to an end, or is it something that you still practice in your own time, or is it something where you still have the occasional session, or is it something where you say every year or every couple of years, I'm going to go off to Venice and have a bit more?
So it's every week. I do it every week. I do a session on Skype every week, and they tend to last about 40 minutes now. And so one of the distinctions of the way that a primal therapy session in particular works is that it's open-ended. So I had 4.5 hour sessions, like on the mat, screaming and gurgling and dribbling and all the rest of it. And now it's down to 40 minutes. I mean, an hour now is a really long session for me. I do it once a week. I still do some processing, so there'll still be feelings coming up. I'll still get triggered. In fact, last night actually I got irritated by something my partner did, and I got close to losing my temper and got quite angry, and I was like, what's all this going on? Worked out what the trigger was, got back to the pain. It turned out to be related to birth. Did some processing of it, and it was like, okay, it's clear now. So I've built an ability to self primal or self regress, and now I don't need the professional help so much. But I use it more like a fitness fanatic would use a personal trainer. So it's I can do it on my own, it's fine, and I process and I journal and I work on myself effectively solo. And if I use a therapist, I can go that bit deeper and it's more concentrated. So that's why I keep it up.
So someone can read a book or go on the internet, learn how to get fit, or they can have a personal trainer, and it's just one extra little bit of help. That was going to be my next question, really. Is it something someone can learn to do on their own? Because you've mentioned how much therapy you had, how you had to save money. You were a high functioning addict with a good CV, so you were able to earn that money. And I was thinking about people who might not be such high functioning addicts, or whose particular problems might have caused them to earn less, or their line of work is just a lower income. What can they do?
Right. So I suppose the first thing I would say is start to journal. So without even having to pay for anything, I mean, nothing the cost of a notebook. What I would recommend is start journaling, and just ask yourself the question to begin with: what did I feel today? What did I feel? Answer write down. I felt XXX, because certainly for me to begin with, I wasn't able to do that. I just wasn't able to do that. And I remember some of my early primal sessions that David, I still remember the therapist, he'd ask me, so what did you feel about that? I'd be like, well, it was fine. And he'd be like, no, but what did you feel? And I'd be like, well, yeah, okay, well, maybe I was a bit irritated. Well, tell me more about being irritated. I'd be like, well, I'm getting irritated with you now. That's it. That's all I felt. And it took the entire the 21-day intensive that I mentioned. It took that. It was like day 18 when I finally started to be able to say, I felt this, I felt sad, I felt angry. So I think if people are in that place where they find it very difficult to even identify with their feelings, then journaling, taking a notebook, writing every evening, think about the moments of your day and complete the sentence, I felt, what that X, that's a great start. There are a couple of books that are worth it. So Jenson, Reclaiming Your Life, has got some fantastic exercises in it. And so the subtitle of that book is A Step-by-Step Guide to Using Regression Therapy. So that's a brilliant place to start. Any of the Arthur Janov books are great. Those would be the two places. So first start journaling, buying some of these books. And then if you feel like it's calling you, then start looking around for therapists who work in this way. There's a great, in Europe, for people listening in Europe, there's Dr. Ingeborg Bosch, who operates out of, well, her practice is based in the Netherlands, and she's written some books, one of which is called Past Reality Integration. It's another regression-based approach. So the resources are out there. It is expensive. It's expensive if you want to get professional help. It's expensive in terms of the therapy time. Is expensive in terms of the time you might need to take off from your work to deal with the fallout. But it's so, if you want to cure yourself, if you're interested in curing yourself of your compulsions, addictions, dysfunctions, then it's the route to take.
And this birth trauma, have you ever had that confirmed, for example, by your mother?
Yeah. So I've got all the records. So I had forceps delivery. I suffered something called fetal bradycardia, which is a drop in the heart rate, and there are records of that. So I definitely had a traumatic birth. I definitely nearly died, and I think I sort of knew that. I did know that I was forceps delivery before I started all of this. I didn't know about the bradycardia until I was a little way into it, and then asked my mother to pull the birth records and discovered that I'd actually had that experience. So yeah, I have no doubt that I had a traumatic birth, and I have no doubt that it impacted me to an enormous extent in terms of my personality, expression of my sexuality, just almost every aspect of who I am was affected by my birth. And Janov talks about it as imprint, all the biological set points that are set up during our birth experience, and they have an epigenetic effect, so they have an effect on the way our genes are expressed, and that lasts for one's lifetime. And this process slowly starts to reset some of those markers, some of those set points.
And regarding this epigenetic effect, I wanted to ask you, you said in your early sessions, you were asked, where do you feel it in the body? Have you noticed any changes within your body as a result of all this therapy? I was thinking, when you said that, I was thinking about Bessel van der Kolk, or however you pronounce it, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Have you noticed bodily changes in any way?
Yeah, so I've become, so I used to hold a huge amount of tension in my my stomach, all around the abdominals, and then deeper into the fascia, which is the connective tissue between the muscles. So all around that area in the lower abdomen, I was very tense, and that carried through right to the back of my legs. So for my whole life, actually, I'm pretty sure I could never touch my toes. I can now pretty much get my palms on the floor. Now, partly that is yoga, but I was doing yoga a long time before I did regression therapy, and I got nowhere near touching my toes. So that's a really easy, obvious marker. The way I hold myself is different. My face has changed. So I've definitely felt a lot of physical changes.
So you say your face has changed? Yeah,
it's become more mature over time and softer, I think. Yeah, I'm not holding as much tension in my face. So
that's interesting. Really interesting. I've got a few questions. We're coming somewhere towards the end of the hour now, so I've got a few questions to close off. from this whole journey, what do you think the key thing that you've learned is, and how will that impact your life from this day on?
That birth matters. That our birth matters. That's the number one takeaway there. So for those of us who had a difficult birth, then what I've learned is, and there's been nothing more valuable than in my life than to go back and process that. And I will keep, so in terms of what does it mean for going forward, I'll keep working as long as I need to work on that level.
Okay. And do you have children yourself?
Yeah, 2 children, 2 young boys. Yeah.
And did your experience influence the circumstances of their birth?
Well, as much as I could. I mean, and obviously as a father, there's a limit to how much of a control I can have over it. I mean, I think it's fortunate that neither of them did have a serious trauma. Neither of them, nothing like the experience I had in terms of coming close to death and so on. So they from that perspective, I'm hoping they won't be affected in the same way. They were cesarean section, and I know that can have its own impacts, but yeah, I'm hoping that it wasn't as traumatic. But I suppose the main takeaway is if they get to later in life and they're experiencing behaviors which they find it difficult to control or don't understand, then I'll be in a position to suggest to them that maybe one of the places to look is their early experiences. And let's see. I mean, that's probably the one thing I've got to offer them. I know that in other conversations with therapists, with Ingeborg Bosch specifically, who I mentioned, who does the work out of Holland, she reckons that 30 is about the earliest that anyone can get their heads around any of this. She doesn't really experience anyone under 30
And how old were you when this began?
About 30. And supposedly, did Jesus start his mission when he was 30? Not that I'm comparing to Jesus. But yeah, so there's probably not a great deal I can. All I can be is be the best dad I can. Yeah.
And you can certainly be a better dad now that you're holding less tension, less irritability, less anger, and responding to fewer triggers.
Less hungover.
Yeah, less hungover. That helps. Okay. So my next couple of questions, just to round things up. If you could go back to talk to that Richard at university, the one who was binge drinking, but doing really well in his studies and very confident that he was going to get a really good job, what, if anything, would you say to that young man?
You see, it's tricky, isn't it? What the hell could I have said to him that he would have acted on? What the hell could I have said to him? I might have said slow down and try and reflect a bit more. But I'm not sure I would have taken the advice. I honestly don't. I mean, I kind of like the idea of the question, but then at the same level, I know that I would have not listened. My 20-year-old me would definitely not listen to my 41-year-old me. No chance. Yeah. So, yeah.
So he needed to take the path he took to learn the lessons that he learned.
So. Yeah, I think so. I don't think he could have done it any other way. And I don't think anybody would have listened to anybody. Yeah.
Okay. Now, my final question. If you've got one last talk, this is the last time you're going to be able to say something on the internet, the last time you're going to be able to speak before an audience. What would you want to say?
You carry your past with you in every moment, and never kid yourself that you can let go of the past. If I've got one pet hate in life, it's people who talk about that somehow we should can or should let go of the past. Like, one carries one's past with them all the time, and to the extent that you've got pain in you is the extent to which you cannot live the fullest, richest life in this moment. And that's the place to go if you want to live a fuller, richer life. And not all of us are full of the pain, of course. Some of us are very privileged and have not had particularly traumatic upbringings. And for those of you, then great. And I wouldn't be telling you to go down this path. But for those of you who have had significant adverse experiences in birth or early childhood, then don't kid yourself that you don't carry every single moment of that with you. And also don't get overwhelmed by that. Yeah, there's a way that you can work at that slowly over time that gradually improves your life.
Fantastic. So Richard Atherton, thank you very, very much for coming on the show today. I want to let my audience know that on your own podcast, Being Human, you do have an interview with Ingeborg Bosch, and you also have an interview with Francis. Is it Janov or Janov?
France Janov. Yeah, it's a hard J.
France Janov. Yeah, that's it. France Janov. And that's on the Being Human podcast, which you can find on Shout Engine and iTunes. Are there any other links or websites that people should know about if they want to get in touch with you and ask you anything about this?
RichardAtherton.net is my personal website. So if you've got questions about this specifically, then please do get in touch. If you're from the business community and you're interested in leadership programs and organizational development programs that don't go deep into this stuff, but have a deep awareness of the human condition when we work in that way, then head to firsthuman.com where you can learn more.
Great. So this has impacted even your professional life because you've learned about human psychology.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, in a professional context, in most, well, it's actually all professional contexts right now, there isn't the space to go in depth into this conversation, but I can still be informed by knowledge of this dynamic when dealing with people. Yeah.
Fantastic. Richard Atherton, thank you very much for being on the Truth, Health, Freedom podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you.
That was the end of my recorded conversation with Richard Atherton. But after the interview had finished, we actually kept on chatting off the cuff for a few minutes. And Richard started talking about things I thought were really interesting and important. So we did an extra couple of minutes recording just to cover some important points. So that's what's coming up right now. I could have edited it cleverly into the interview and pretended that it was all part of the main body of the interview, but I don't do things like that. This is the Truth, Health, Freedom podcast, not the fakery Health, Freedom podcast. So I'm just sticking it here at the end for you to enjoy and take something out of. Yeah, so before our interview, I only knew, I'd heard the name Janov and had heard the name Primal Scream. I knew it because of John Lennon, and I knew it because of the band Primal Scream, but I knew nothing more about it.
Yes, that's right. And that's the tragedy with Janov, I think, is that, he did have his moment and he was very famous. And as you say, he was John Lennon's therapist and he was on the late night shows in America and was sort of borderline household name, I think, for a few years in the States. But his therapy, primal therapy, has been roundly dismissed. There was a recent survey of top professionals by the American Psychological Association, and they classified the primal therapy techniques and approach, the primal therapy approach as discredited. That's what it's officially classified as, that discredited therapy. And there is a real tragedy in that. And I believe that's because it got hijacked by a bunch of therapists who basically had you scream in a room and told you were cured and really didn't understand the subtleties and the depth that it requires. And I mean, it takes years to build the intuitions and the skills to become an effective therapist who works with regression, because it is such a it's such a deep process, but it's also so easy to get it wrong. You've got to have people really in the groove. You've got to have people really being real. Like, you can't have someone go back and describe a scene from their childhood and their past and not be fully connected to it, because if they're not, then you're just indulging them in a story. So it takes something. But for those who are able to work in this way, it really does work. And it's a strategy that is not more widespread as a Primal or any of the other related techniques on the one hand, but it's entirely understandable because this requires us feeling old pain. And all of the therapists working in this field will say something similar, is that they'll go to a conference and they'll say, and they'll describe the techniques and they'll describe the approach, and all of the other therapists in the room will switch off because there's this invitation for them themselves to go back and feel their old pain, and understandably none of them want to. And so it's very hard to get traction professionally with these ideas because of that. And why a therapist, I mean, most of the time it's because they're holding pain themselves. So of course it's likely that they're going to be triggered by this conversation and want to go into more intellectual styles of therapy, or ones that are based on behaviors and coping strategies and so on, none of which really require you to go and feel any of this old pain. I mean, it may require you to analyze your childhood and describe it and so on, but not at the depth we're talking about with these techniques.
But not to truly feel it.
Exactly.
It's the difference between thinking it and feeling it.
Yeah, describing it and telling the story. And that's, I think, the other confusion sometimes with this therapy is people, you've got to get out of that victim mentality, Richard, right? You've got to just leave that in the past, and you're going to re-traumatize yourself or re-victimize yourself. And they don't understand what this is about. This is it's the polar opposite of being a victim of one's childhood. It's going back and reliving and empowering yourself to do the things you should have done but couldn't do at the time, or say the things you wanted to say but couldn't say at the time. So it's absolutely not being a victim. It's 100% taking full personal responsibility for your past and taking full ownership of every moment of your past and feeling that old pain and reliving it and healing from it. So it couldn't be further from being a victim.
So it's using your past to set your present free.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it.
Fantastic. Right. I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you very, very much, Richard Atherton, for that little extra bit at the end. For those who didn't know what was going on there, why I'd finished the interview and started again, that was because we were just having an off-the-cuff chat after the interview, and Richard came up with some really fascinating, interesting points I describe as pure gold, and I wanted that on record. I was thinking, oh no, I've stopped record, but we did record that, and thank you very much for that extra little bit, because I know you're a busy man and I'm taking your time. So thank you very much, Richard Atherton. Thank you.
Thank you, Al.